Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on oral proficiency assessment, brought to you by the Center for Applied Linguistics and the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center at Georgetown University. In today's webinar, we'll begin with some introductions, talk about the basics of oral proficiency assessment, share some best practices for oral proficiency assessments, and then wrap up with a summary, discussion, and conclusion. So we'll start with our introduction. First, we'd like to briefly introduce ourselves. My name is Jamie Morgan, and I'm a senior project manager at the Center for Applied Linguistics, commonly known as CAL, where I also manage our work with the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center, commonly known as the AELRC. I'm joined today by my colleagues Francesca Di Silvio and Jenna Bushton, who will also be facilitating the webinar. Francesca is the Director of World Languages at CAL and the Associate Director of the AELRC. And Jenna is a research assistant at CAL and contributes to our work with the AELRC as well. We'd also like to tell you a little bit more about our organizations, CAL and the AELRC, for those who are not familiar with us. CAL is a nonprofit founded in 1959 and located in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to promote language learning and cultural understanding by serving as a trusted source for research, resources, and policy analysis. And we work on a variety of different projects related to language education. The AELRC is a Title VI language resource center that's collaboratively led by researchers at Georgetown University, CAL, and ACTFL. And the center's mission is to facilitate useful assessment and evaluation practices that help foreign language educators innovate and improve their programs, ensure accountability to students and society, and articulate the value of foreign language studies in the world today. So now that we've introduced ourselves and our organizations, let's talk about the purpose of today's webinar. This webinar is designed to help you develop an understanding of oral proficiency assessment in the context of world language teaching and learning, and to help you learn best practices for designing, administering, and rating performance tasks to assess oral proficiency in this context. By the end of the webinar, we hope that you're able to define language assessment, oral proficiency assessment, and performance assessment, understand the various best practices for oral proficiency assessment that we're going to share, and have an opportunity to reflect on your own experiences with and questions about oral proficiency assessment. So now let's get started with some oral proficiency assessment basics. First, we'd like to talk a little bit about language assessment, just to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we have a shared understanding of what language assessment is and what it can do for you. So we've defined language assessment as planned measurement of someone's language knowledge or skills that is used to gather information that you need to make inferences and decisions about that person's language abilities. So this is a really high-level definition of language assessment that can encompass a number of different types of assessment that you're using in your classrooms or programs. And since you're here today, you're likely already aware of the many benefits of assessment, but we also wanted to highlight a few things that assessment helps both teachers and students do. It helps us monitor language growth over time, which can be helpful for teachers in understanding and tracking student progress. Maybe that's from unit to unit or year to year. And it gives students a concrete understanding of where they started and what they've accomplished. It also helps us learn about language abilities at a certain point in time and make decisions about what to do next. So this could include decisions about making changes to your learning objectives, your curriculum, your teaching strategies, etc. Or even students making changes about how they practice the language and how they study the language, both in and outside of the classroom. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it helps us enhance, empower, and celebrate language learning, which I think makes it a really powerful tool for keeping students engaged in the classroom and encouraging them to want to continue with their language study long-term. And as you can see on this slide, there are numerous other things that language assessment in particular can help teachers and students do and recognize in the classroom. So in addition to helping teachers with decision-making surrounding instruction, language assessment allows students to really have some ownership in the language learning process They understand where they are compared to where they want to be, and then they can set realistic goals for themselves for the future. It also helps both teachers and students track growth in terms of proficiency, measure learning outcomes, and reflect on what's going well and if there are any areas for improvement. Language assessment can also be a useful tool for demonstrating the value of a program, which in turn could lead to additional programmatic support or additional interest from students in enrolling in the program. Or it may reveal some aspects of a program that need to change and then serve as evidence for advocating for those changes. And finally, language assessment can create really valuable opportunities for students to participate in authentic performance tasks, which are really essential to their overall language growth and development, and their ability to actually use the language within and outside the classroom. And we're going to talk a little bit more about performance assessment in the next slides. Before we do, we'd like to ask you if there are any other benefits of language assessment that you can think of that we haven't covered here thus far. So if you have any ideas, if there are any, we would love to hear from you. And we ask that you please type your answers to this question in the chat box on Zoom so that we can share them with fellow attendees. And we'll just take a couple minutes to see if there are any other ideas. All right, not seeing any so far. I know this is a pretty comprehensive list. If you do have any ideas, feel free to add them as we continue. I see one now for placement purposes, absolutely. All right, we'll go ahead and move on in the interest of time, but feel free to continue adding ideas to the chat as we go. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, one type of assessment that's really critical to effective world language teaching and learning is performance assessment. And so we're going to focus on performance assessment and performance tasks for the rest of this webinar. For those of you who are not familiar with performance assessment, this type of assessment requires students to use language in real-life situations for real-world purposes, thus demanding that students develop an understanding of how language is used in real life. It's based on performing with language rather than demonstrating some kind of passive knowledge or understanding of language. And it typically involves one or more of the three communicative modes. So interpretive communication, this involves one-way communication in which a learner is receiving a message. Two-way communication between learners is interpersonal. And then presentational is, again, one-way communication in which a learner is transmitting a message. And this type of language assessment helps teachers and students understand how well students are meeting learning objectives. And those learning objectives are typically tied to proficiency levels and standards in this situation. This type of assessment is task-based, so teachers and students are getting that really valuable information about students' authentic language abilities, right? How well they can use language in the real world when actual communication is needed. And both formative assessments, those assessments that are providing information on student progress throughout instruction, and summative assessments, which are providing information about mastery of some kind of skill or topic taught in the unit or course. Both of those types of assessments should provide opportunities for students to show what they know and can do through performance. So here we have just a couple short examples of performance assessments in the different modes. For interpersonal communication, students might be asked to work with a partner to ask for and give directions. For interpretive communication, students might be asked to read movie reviews and then explain which movie they'd like to see based on the information that they've read. And for presentational communication, students might be asked to write an email introducing themselves to a new language exchange partner. And these are just a few very brief examples. There are many, many more ways in which these modes can be assessed through performance tasks. And now we're going to watch a quick video that provides an example of a classroom activity that requires students to perform with the language. And this activity also allows the teacher to check for learning for formative assessment purposes. And this video was produced by the StarTalk initiative and shows a task that is used in an Arabic classroom at the high school level.
ما مشكلة أم، هل نحن في العالم الخرج من شوت؟
آه، هل المشكلة في شوت مع الاستدامية.
Keep the conversation going. It's a great way of being able to ask the students to use the vocab and the grammar that they have learned in to put it into practice, but in a more kind of like a quasi-authentic way. So kind of having a conversation about these topics. So in a way that the conversation will go more naturally between them.
أنا عندي
أنا
The goal is to push them to talk as much as they can about a specific topic and to really keep that conversation going until they have exhausted all the information that they can say in the target language about that topic. كيف الحال اليوم؟ The more you model it for them, but with them. So use one of your students in the classroom to kind of walk the others through that activity and see how you can use these expressions, where to incorporate them. على حق يا تبا. أنت على حق، أنت على حق. الاستدامة مهمة جدا، مهمة جدا. لماذا تظنين أن الاستدامة مهمة جدا؟
لأن الآن الأرض ستموت.
How would you when to intervene and how to kind of help them keep building that conversation until they have exhausted all the information they have about that topic. In my Arabic 350, we used it today to kind of ask their peers about their opinion about sustainability and waste management at their school.
ننقذ العالم.
نعم فكرة جيدة. وأنت المستمع.
And see if they agree or disagree with the practices in place. So students had to also use some of the expressions to be able to whether validate another's their peers' opinion or to contradict their peers' opinion or also to ask for suggestions or for solutions for the problem.
وإن علينا أن نجد حل في المشكلات المشكلات في العالم.
والزجاج.
ماذا تقدير الحل للمشكلة؟
ليس عندهم
أظن تدوير حل لمشكلة.
أنا أسكن في بيت نحن في مدرسة شوت.
So in my Arabic 150 today, we use the keep the conversation going to practice the family vocabulary as well as words about likes to express your likes and dislikes. The students were asked to pair with another student and to have quasi-authentic conversation about like meeting someone new and how would you ask them questions to get to know more about them. ما تدرس؟ فعل.
ماذا تدرس؟
ممتاز. أين تسكن؟ تسكنين في شوط. ممتاز.
All right, we'll go ahead and stop it there. And before we move on, we'd love to hear what you all saw in the video and what you think about what you saw as it relates to performance assessment. So we have some guiding questions here up on the slide. We'd love to hear from you in the chat box on Zoom about what the students did to complete the task that we saw in the video, what the teacher's role was, what the teacher was doing to support them, what skills or knowledge the task was assessing, whether or not you think this is a good performance assessment task, and if you've ever done anything similar with your students. So we'll just take a couple minutes to see if you have anything to share in the chat. Okay, I noticed a student invited her peer into the conversation with a question. Absolutely. So there are opportunities for asking and answering questions in this activity. Is the teacher grading? So I think in this particular example, one of the things that we had seen in the text on the screen is that the teacher can circulate throughout the room, and perhaps, they have a checklist they can check for learning as students are completing the activity. So maybe not a grade, but maybe they're gathering information that they would use to then inform instruction. Students performing a role play, the teacher's scaffolding, exactly. Some experience doing similar activities. It's an authentic situation. Students seem very engaged, committed. Yeah, great. All right, we'll go ahead and move on. But again, feel free to continue to add your ideas to the chat as we go. So after seeing this example and learning a little more about performance assessment, we're going to talk a little bit about what makes a good performance assessment task. So good tasks are based on needs, which are based on your objectives and the resources that you have available to you for assessment. They're authentic, as we've said a few times already today, both in terms of reflecting real-world situations and activities, and being authentic to your students' individual lived experiences. So these need to make sense to them. They're contextualized, meaning students have all the essential background information that they need to really imagine themselves in the situation and then perform accordingly. This one's very important. They're appropriate for students in terms of proficiency levels, as well as grade levels and age or developmental levels. So asking students to perform tasks that are beyond their level can really have a negative effect on your students' motivation, and it can also provide inaccurate or incomplete information about students' abilities. And finally, good performance assessment tasks have clear standards, meaning you know what it means to perform well on the task, and you have some established criteria of a successful performance. Also, these expectations and standards should really be provided to students so that they know what they're expected to do, and then again, can perform successfully on the task. Okay, so now that we have this foundation in language assessment, and particularly in performance assessment, we're going to dive into oral proficiency. So the definition that we have here of oral proficiency is the ability to communicate verbally in a functional and accurate way in the target language. And a high degree of oral proficiency implies that one can apply linguistic knowledge to new contexts and situations, making it really important skill to support and assess in world language classrooms. And before you can assess oral proficiency, you need to provide opportunities for students to develop their oral proficiency skills. So we'd like to highlight just a few strategies for supporting this development in the classroom. First, it's helpful to conduct a needs analysis of sorts by watching what your students are able to do when speaking the language, and then making a plan for how you can support their growth. So you may have some activities that are similar to the video that we just watched that would allow you to walk around your classroom and see what your students are doing well and what some areas for improvement might be. You should also include learning outcomes and objectives that relate to speaking in your lesson and unit plans, just to make sure that they're a focus of your instruction. And of course, design performance assessment tasks that are requiring students to speak the language, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later in the webinar. In addition, building time and opportunities for students to collaborate and interact will also give them additional chances to speak with each other in the target language. Some of these activities could be those that require students to gather information, solve problems. They could involve informal conversations with you as the teacher or with each other about topics of interest, current events. And then things like games and turn and talk moments and discussions are also really great options. And finally, you can support your students' accuracy in oral language by providing really targeted, actionable feedback as they're participating in these activities. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about feedback later in the webinar. So in terms of oral proficiency assessment, this type of assessment is used to determine what students can do with the language, gives them an opportunity to show how well they can do those things in the language in those really authentic real life situations. And they can be really useful for overall learning and helping you as teachers determine instructional needs. And before we move on to specifics, we wanted to just share some general high-level best practices for assessing oral proficiency. First, it's important to focus on language for communication, so language that has a purpose. Tasks should be engaging and relevant for your students, as well as appropriate for their levels. If your students are older, it may be helpful to share the rubrics that you're going to be using to rate their performances with them before they complete the tasks, so that they just really understand and internalize the expectations. Assessments should be enjoyable from the get-go and throughout the pacing, which can be helped by starting with an easier task if you're going to have a series of tasks, and then making those gradually increase in difficulty as you go. Finally, at the end, winding students down when they reach their ceiling, so when it's clear that there's some breakdown in communication, and then allowing them to finish the assessment with a task that can be more easily completed so they walk away feeling successful. And really briefly, before we move on to the next section of the webinar on best practices, we're just going to ask that you take a moment to reflect on your own experiences with oral proficiency assessment. So again, we invite you to type into the chat in Zoom if you'd like to share with fellow attendees. And the questions that we have here are, how are you currently assessing oral proficiency? What assessments or tasks do you use to do so? And do you think those tasks are aligned with some of these characteristics of good tasks that we presented today? So we'll take just a couple minutes to see if you have any thoughts. Okay, presentations, interviews with students, student-led conversations, role plays. Definitely all great options for assessing oral proficiency. OPIs. Students are facilitating seminars, small group conversations, some more presentations. Great. All right, again, we'll go ahead and move on, but please feel free to continue sharing in the chat. And I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Francesca to talk about best practices for oral proficiency assessment.
Great, thanks so much, Jamie. Can you confirm you can hear me?
All good.
Okay, great. So now with that overview done, we want to talk a little bit, we have a brief time, but a little bit more details on specific oral proficiency assessment best practices related to designing, administering, and rating performance tasks. And we'll take a look at some specific task examples that will help illustrate these practices. So just at the very top, when you're starting from scratch, these are some steps to think about how you can start designing your performance tasks. And they're really based on the principles of backward design, where you're going to keep the objective in mind from the outset. So first, again, this is for a single task. You want to choose a single performance objective or learning outcome that you plan to assess. This objective or outcome might be coming from your unit plan or other curriculum documents. And when you have that objective, you're going to think about ways that you can assess student progress or mastery of that selected objective through allowing students to communicate meaningfully with the language. And of course, it's important to think about your target proficiency level and communicative mode given your selected objective and your unit plans. So one helpful tool that we'd like to highlight for designing performance tasks in terms of objectives is the necessful, actful, can-do statements. We have a link here, and Jenna, if you could drop in the chat. So if you're not familiar with these, it's a set of documents that are fully available online from ACTFL, and they are aligned with the ACTFL proficiency levels from novice to superior and organized by communicative mode. So these are statements in the form of can-do statements for students about what they can do with the language at each of the levels. So for example, you can choose your mode and your level. So a statement for the intermediate mid interpersonal communication mode is I can exchange preferences, feelings, or opinions and provide basic advice on a variety of familiar topics. So that's really high level, but then when you take that statement, you can tailor it to the topics and essential questions that you're covering in your unit. So filling in specifically what students are providing preferences, opinions, and advice about that's related to your unit and related to the interests of your students. And we'll look at a couple more examples in the next slides. So these are a few, again, of the high-level can-do statements that are available on that website at different levels that you can choose as your objectives and adapt for measuring oral proficiency. So at the novice level, we're talking about communicating basic information about yourself and the people you know. At intermediate mid, that might be talking about daily activities and personal preferences. And at advanced mid, talking about communicating on a wide variety of present, past, and future events. So things like narration. And again, this is very high level, but once you've determined your performance objective, which may be in the form of a can-do statement, now you're going to think through what students will have to do to complete your task. So what successful completion of the task actually looks like, and how completing that task will demonstrate how well students can perform the objective. So using this thinking, you're going to write up the instructions that you will give for the task, as well as any background information and materials that you give students to support them in completing the task. So again, this is really high level and generic. We're going to take a look now at some sample oral performance tasks in the next few slides. And as we saw in the previous section, it's really critical to design your task based on your students' age and developmental levels, as well as their lived experiences. So we'll look at tasks that are designed both for younger learners in K-8, a set of tasks for those students, as well as learners in high school through college, and how they're actually quite different. Not necessarily in terms of the level of language, but in terms of the topics and the context for the task. So all of the examples we're showing are going to be in English, but of course you would be providing materials and questions to students in the target language. And as we'll talk about it in a little bit later, it may be appropriate to give your students instructions and scoring rubrics in English or the target language, depending on their level of proficiency. So here's our first performance task that is for K through 8 students, so younger learners. This is actually a sample task template that comes from Cal's SOPA oral proficiency assessment, which is designed for learners in those younger grades. And it's also important to note that this is a paired assessment. So 2 pairs of students interacting with an administrator at the same time. So as you can see in the template, this is a task that is designed to assess the objective of identifying and naming objects. You can see that on the left. It's a novice level task. And what's helpful in this template is it lays out the language expectations for what we expect students to produce. So in this case, they're just single words or short phrases using familiar vocabulary. And again, a key element of a successful performance task, but especially for this age level, is that there are also supports that make it more accessible and engaging for young learners. So they're going to have objects that they see and manipulate. In this case, the task is called the magic bag. The administrator actually puts a bag of objects on the table, asks students to point to and interact with them, and then ask questions about the object. And then you can see on the right in the instructions here, this is a task that can be really flexible depending on your students and what you're covering. So there's examples of different questions that you might ask of the students, again, with the goal of eliciting just single words or short phrases and seeing if they can do that. Next, please. So here's another SOPA task, again, for young learners, but at a higher level. So this is to describe, and the expectation is more at the intermediate level. So we're expecting sentences. And in this task, students are given a complex image or a series of images that show a sequence. And it's really supportive of the students. It's really meaningful for students because they're being asked to describe a sequence of pictures that they might be learning about in school, including in other subject areas. So this might be like a life cycle of a butterfly, for example. You're asking students to describe each part of the picture. And next. So this is the last SOPA task we'll show. This is an advanced task. And this is asking students to express and support their own opinions. And so we're looking for connected sentences and at the highest level, advanced high, paragraph level discourse that's really detailed. And what the overall task is presenting students with a list of potential school rules. It contextualizes it in their local school. You know, the school is proposing these potential 3 rules. What do you think about them? Do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea? So what I want to note here, again, for support for the students and why it's a good performance task, we have additional support in the form of the printed text of the rules and visuals. We have something that can be really tailored to your students. So you're choosing the rules and also giving students choice in which rule they want to talk about. And now, again, just quickly, we're going to show 3 different tasks that are designed for older students. So these would be high school to college level students. These particular tasks and templates come from a previous Cal assessment called the COPI. It's the Computerized Oral Proficiency Instrument. These are for Chinese, but of course you can see it in English. And so these are tasks that were given via computer, but same thing, performance tasks that are really situated for students at this level. So you'll see that even though there's different proficiency levels here, they're contextualized and appropriate for the age of the student. So this novice level, it's asking students to name objects in a classroom. So these are things that they can do with kind of single words at the novice level, but it's situated in the context that's appropriate for high school or university students. So they are speaking with an exchange student and talking with a student in describing these objects. And here is a sample intermediate task. So here we have, it looks like a simpler template, but it's still, a really robust task. So situated where a student is meeting with a Chinese conversation partner, the partner asks, actually in the computerized test, we have the partner speak aloud in a prompt, ask you to tell him about yourself, and then you start telling about yourself in Chinese. So this is describing yourself. It's a really appropriate intermediate level task, and it's authentic because that's what you might do when a student comes to your school or when you're traveling in another country and learning more about them. And then finally, we have an advanced level task. This is contextualized in study abroad, and it's asking students to perform the advanced level function of apologizing. In this case, it's a specific scenario that's described to the student that they've gotten home late and they need to call their host family and apologize for being late. I guess it is important to note for the COPI, usually students would be given a set of 3 tasks that are at the same level and really similar templates, but on sort of different topics. So one might be apologize for running late. One is like apologize for breaking something in the home, and there's another form of apology. So they have a little bit of choice here too. But again, this is targeted to the advanced level and appropriate for the age and developmental level of these students. Okay, so having seen some of those examples quickly, want to talk at a high level about kind of tips and best practices for administering your tasks as well as rating your performance tasks. So in terms of administering performance tasks, especially if you're creating new tasks that you haven't done yet, you really need to consider how much time you will have for administering those during class. And that may influence whether you'll assess students individually or perhaps in pairs or in groups. Another consideration, of course, for pairing students, that could also be a choice that's appropriate for students' ages and engagement. That's really built into the SOPA, but it also, of course, can save time. Think about what the other students in your class will be doing during the assessment. So what they'll work on or be tasked with while you are doing the assessment with individual or pairs of students. And it's also really important to think about, as I said earlier, how you're going to be providing instructions to your students. You want to make sure that the instructions are as clear as possible. Students know the expectations so that they're able to show what they can do with the language. They're able to perform successfully on the task. So those instructions for oral proficiency tasks, it may be appropriate to provide them in written form, in oral form, or in both. And you may provide the instructions in English or the target language, again, depending on your students and their proficiency level. And then finally, in terms of thinking about administration, you also want to, of course, make sure that you have considered and gathered all of the visuals, manipulatives, and other supports that are required for the task, that you have those on hand. Everyone has equal access to those materials. Okay, and so now we're going to show a short video. This actually features Jenna. You can see her on the screen here. This is a SOPA test administration. So as I said, this is for students in grades K through 8. It's a paired assessment where the administrator is asking questions and interacting with both students. And we'll just watch a couple minutes of it, and I hope the sound quality is okay, but I'll just note that students are sometimes, they talk really at a low level. So if you're having any trouble hearing, just also watch kind of the body language and the interaction between the administrator and the students. What this is asking is students to describe pictures in a book that they know well, a storybook, which is Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And it's assessing at essentially the advanced level because we're looking for students to narrate and produce connected sentences.
Okay, so we're gonna start. Hello, thank you for joining me today.
Raymond.
Raymond, nice to meet you. I'm Miss Jenna.
But it's not with E. It's like that, not with a E.
Yeah, with an A. Awesome. Yeah. So we have these name tags for you. I'm already wearing mine, but I'm gonna ask you guys to take these and.
Oh, Jamie, I think, were you supposed to skip ahead a little bit?
Yes, unfortunately, I'm not able to do that. I don't see the option to do so on my end.
Oh, okay. All right, we'll watch just a minute. It's not gonna be the task I described. We're starting at the beginning of the assessment.
These in English. I'm going to
We're gonna-
ask you some questions.
We're gonna make a conversation.
Yeah, when it's your turn, please say as much as you can in English. Okay? Do you have any questions?
Like, are we gonna ask about math?
No.
Doing math? Oh, no. Is it like the a news and it's gonna appear on the whole world?
No.
Are we talking about the 90s?
No, you'll see what we're talking about. It's not hard though, don't worry. Okay.
I
So
figure
we're
it's
gonna
about the
start-
weather because there's something there.
Yes. So we're gonna start the first activity called the magic bag. So I'm gonna ask you questions
Munchie.
about
Munchie.
the magic bag, and you'll take turns answering my questions.
Munchie.
So, Sophia, you want to open the bag and see what's inside? You can
How?
pour everything out onto the
Munchie.
table.
I mean like this?
Yeah. So
Don't-
we'll open it like this,
don't
and
open
then
it.
let's pour it out and see what's inside.
Okay, is it like stuff?
Oh,
Oh,
fruits.
yes. Yes.
All
Fruits.
right, let's
Cherry.
see yours.
Oh, this is my favorite. Wait, can they stay
Wait,
in
they're
the wall?
they're
No, we gotta leave
magnets.
them on the table.
They're magnets.
They're magnets.
All right, let's see.
I used to
Okay.
thought
Watermelon.
this was a vegetable, but I know now it's a fruit.
Yeah. All right, Raymond.
Watermelon.
Can you
my
point to
favorite.
the apple, please? Okay. Sophia, point to the banana. Raymond, point to a purple fruit. Good. Sophia, point to a orange fruit.
I have this orange fruit at home.
Nice. Raymond,
9
can you
dots.
put all of the yellow fruits together?
On top.
Sophia, can you put all of the red fruits together?
And purple and orange are just so low.
All right, Jamie, let's stop it here. Thanks.
So low.
So that was a little bit different what I expected to show, but I did want to share. This was actually an example of the first SOPA task you saw. This is, starting at the novice level. So this is showing the principle of starting low, and then the task proceeds, they get more advanced, and then they end with a wind down that allows students to be successful. And I think some key elements here are just showing how this is a paired assessment. You might have to wrangle your students a little bit if they're younger, but they're really excited. They're talking with each other. They're producing more language. And then Jenna here is giving equal opportunities to both students to speak. So that's really important with a paired assessment. But this was just a novice level task. It progresses higher. All right, next slide, please. So last, but certainly not least, it's really important to think about how you're going to be rating your performance tasks. You need to consider what methods and materials that you're going to use in light of what you're trying to learn about your students' abilities and how you will use that information. So of course, whether this is a formative or summative assessment, and where it is in your unit. And as Jamie said before, you should always plan to share your evaluation methods and materials with your students in a way that's age appropriate, as well as with other teachers in your program and stakeholders such as administrators and parents. That's so everything is really clear and transparent. And again, students are able to perform to the best of their abilities and really assess their own progress as well once they know what they're being rated on. So performance tasks, as you know, and as you've seen, these are not something that can be marked simply right or wrong. So we recommend using either checklists or rubrics, which will allow you to compare the student performance that you see against pre-established criteria. So that way you have clear criteria for rating performances that you might be rating in real time against descriptions for a range of the performances you might see. So checklists versus rubrics, there are some advantages and disadvantages, of course, reasons to use both. Checklists are quite easy and quick to use, but they're more limited because they just show generally whether something is or isn't accomplished. It's a binary rather than providing information about the quality of what students are producing in terms of language. Rubrics, on the other hand, can definitely take more time to develop and use, but they can provide more detailed information for you and your students about the quality of the performances on the task, as well as specific features in their performance. So quickly, we'll just show a couple of samples. This is a sample checklist for a speaking task. This is actually for student self-assessment. So the student is using the checklist themselves. And it's really simple. It would look the same for a teacher, just kind of can-dos. The student can do it with help, or can't do it yet. And you can check off different elements of the performance task. And then for rubrics, we can do a whole webinar. We will do a whole webinar, which will advertise on rubrics. But at a high level, you can think about two types of rubrics, holistic versus analytic. So this is an example of a holistic rubric where you're going to be giving a single rating between 1 and 4 that's based on the full performance. So while the rating considers the full performance and different elements, so you can see in the description, you're looking at errors, pronunciation, use of different structures and cultural practices, et cetera. You're thinking of those as a whole in determining what level the student is performing at. And that's in contrast to an analytic rubric, which provides ratings for different elements, separate ratings on, for example, a 1 to 4 scale for different elements of the student performance. So the advantage of an analytic rating scale is that it can provide more detailed feedback on what the student is doing well and what needs improvement, especially as there might be variability in some of these different features. And so when rating tasks, it's really important to consider, of course, the methods for rating, as we just described, but also how you will be providing feedback to your students. So feedback is going to provide information to your students about their progress, and it helps them monitor their own development. It can come in many different forms beyond, of course, formal grading. That's an important part of feedback, but there are other ways to provide feedback, and they're really critical for students. And just keep in mind, remember always that you're giving feedback on students' work, not on students themselves. And you're going to want to use rating justifications because those will support your rating. They'll provide evidence for why you gave the rating you did, and give meaningful feedback to students. That could be really helpful to students, parents, and other stakeholders to see what's behind the rating and how they can progress. So now we will quickly look at some sample rating justifications. These are all related to the STOPA task that we showed. So just a few quick examples, again, of how you might write a rating justification. These will obviously be really specific to your tasks and your rubrics or checklists that you're using. But this is for a novice level STOPA task. And you can see that there's a description making reference to what language the student produced, even specific text they produced, and with reference to the different sublevels they could be rated at, why they sustained this level, why they didn't quite reach the next level. In this case, it's really rated according to the actual scale, but even if you're using a rubric of 1 to 4, you can provide a justification of why something is a 3 rather than a 4. This is for an intermediate level task. So again, you see that it provides examples of what language the student used and how that relates to the rating. So what was appropriate, what might have indicated even a higher rating. In this case, this is a task that kind of only probes at the intermediate mid-level. So this is task specific, but maybe the next level will show whether they can produce that advanced language. And then lastly, this is for an advanced task. Again, of course, as for all of them, the student, it shows what the student produced and kind of evidence of for that rating. In this case, because the student is expected to produce more language, the justification is clearly longer as well. And the justification provides evidence of what the student produced, both in terms of language quantity and quality. Okay, and coming to the end here, I'll take a minute. I'll ask people to put things in the chat, but also really just think about reflecting on your own, which is fine because we're getting towards the conclusion of our time. So we want to have you take a minute to reflect and think about what we just talked about in terms of designing tasks, in terms of administering tasks and rating tasks. Think about what you've done in your own classroom or observed from others in your language program. Think about what you're doing well and what might need to improve in all of these features. So if anyone wants to type into the chat, that'd be great. I'll pause for a minute. And then I do see in the chat that people were asking for the slides. This is being recorded, and I think we can post the recording and the slides, so that will be available to you and anyone who wasn't able to make it later. So let me just take 1 minute and then I'll turn it over to you, Jenna, to wrap up. Anyone putting into the chat? Yes, I see. We'll put everything in there. So I see from Elizabeth, thank you, that you've created rubrics for your teachers that include a student reflection rubric. That's great. Yeah, we'll delve into that more in our rubrics webinar, but it's really important if you are able to share rubrics across programs, across teachers, and use them with your students. It can provide more feedback, more coherence. And as you said, a positive experience. The students are also reflecting on their own work. So not only understanding what the teacher rubric is, but using their own rubric. All right, and one more before we transition, we see that someone indicated they think they can do a better job at modeling conversations for their students. Yeah, I think that's a really great example. This is something, not just in your assessment, you can practice those types of assessment tasks and model for your students to be sure that they're going to be able to produce that language themselves. So thanks so much. Next slide, let's turn it over to Jenna.
All right, thanks, Francesca. So that was a lot of information. So we are going to go into a quick review of what we talked about today. So in this webinar, you learned about a lot of things. And within these topics, that included defining oral proficiency assessment and performance assessment. You also learned how to design and administer performance tasks to assess oral proficiency. And then finally, you learned a little bit about how to score and rate these performance tasks. So here we have another reflection opportunity. We're going to ask you, 1, what is your biggest takeaway from this webinar? And 2, how will you apply what you've learned from this webinar to your own teaching context? So we can take a few minutes and see if anyone wants to reflect on what they've learned today. You can type your answer in the chat. All right, so you see evaluating speaking skills requires training. Yes, it's definitely something that will get better the more you practice it, but it does require some practice. Appreciate the specific examples. Yes, it's definitely useful to see all of these concepts put into practice. That's when you can really get a good sense of how to apply these concepts while you're teaching. Design task examples. Good. Well, you can continue to put your reflections in the chat, but we are going to move on to a quick Q&A session. So this is an opportunity for everyone to ask some questions about what we talked about today. Maybe you have a question about something we covered that you want a little more clarification on. Maybe you have some additional questions on topics that we didn't explicitly talk about today, but they're still related to oral proficiency assessment. So if you have any questions that you want us to go into more detail about, feel free to use the Q&A to submit your question, or I think you can also just type your question in the chat as well. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, but once again, feel free to type some questions as we move on. If I see any come up, I will make sure to address it. So we can go on to the next slide. And next, as we begin to wrap up, we want to inform you about another free webinar coming up that is hosted by Cal and the AELRC. And that will be held on Monday, June 12th, during 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And this webinar will be about developing and using rubrics. So we kind of went over that a little bit in today's webinar, but if you want to go more in depth about that topic, we invite you to join this upcoming webinar as well. And if you're interested, I will drop a link in the chat. Sarah, yes, the webinar will be recorded and we will send that to everyone as well. So in the chat, I hope you can see the link I just sent. That will take you to the website where you can sign up for this upcoming webinar. You can also use this QR code on the screen. If you scan it, that should also take you to the website. You don't have to sign up immediately. If you need some time to think it over, you can also feel free to save this link somewhere as you look at your schedule. And then it looks like we actually have a question in the Q&A box. So from Rebecca, it's the first time I've seen vocabulary rated separately from the structure. How is a proficiency level decided on taking both into account? So Jamie, Francesca, do any of you want to talk about this?
Yeah, I can take this one. I think this was related to one of the example rubrics we had. So in a rubric, in an analytic rubric, this is actually really common. That's not necessarily, it didn't show the steps of getting to proficiency level, but there are ways to do that. All of those would be taken into account in deciding on a proficiency level. If you're really familiar with the actual levels, they take into account kind of all of these features. So it wouldn't be saying, you know, your advanced mid in vocabulary and your advanced low in structure. You would produce kind of a global rating. And actually on both of the assessments we described that come from Cal, those are full assessments, not single a task. The tasks are rated individually, and some of the components can be rated separately, but they produce a global rating, a single global rating. And the idea here is that you, especially for a global rating, you take into account the performance over multiple tasks and the sustained performance that you're able to see. So you might see, especially with a OPI type assessment, you might see the students have glimpses of being at a higher level or having really good vocabulary in a specific area, but not others. You would still rate them on the highest level that was able to be sustained. So I know that was a lot of info and not exactly answering the question, but I think that they're often rated separately to decompose either for a rubric for a specific task or tasks within a larger assessment. But then at a high level, I think you would still probably give a global proficiency rating. You might be giving proficiency ratings in different skills. You might give a listening versus speaking proficiency rating, for example. But those would both be considered in the ultimate proficiency level. Thanks for that question, Rebecca. And thanks for everyone who's typing in their takeaways. That's really helpful. Just to reiterate, and then I'll turn it back to Jenna. Yes, this is being recorded. We'll make sure to share it, and I think it'll be posted on the AELRC website, and that will be the case for the next webinar as well.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Francesca. If anyone else has any questions, once again, feel free to type them in. And we're going to start wrapping up. Just as a few general reminders. As Francesca mentioned, we are recording this and we will be uploading this to the websites shown here. So not only will you be able to see the recording of this webinar, but you will also find some other resources talking about assessment and oral proficiency on both of these websites. So these are the AELRC website and the Cal website. You can scan these QR codes if you want. They'll take you directly to the website. You could also type in the names of these organizations on Google, and they'll be one of the first things that come up. And feel free once again to take a picture for later if you prefer. And finally, we just want to say thank you for joining us today. We love having so many people come out. And really quick, we would like to invite you to take a fast survey for a webinar evaluation. So I'm going to drop the link in the chat once again. All right. And if you click on this link, it'll take you to a really quick survey. Basically, we are always looking for suggestions for improvement. If you have any feedback on things that you liked, things that you didn't like, things that you think we could improve on in the future, or even if you have a topic for a future webinar that you want us to cover, you can leave all of those opinions in this webinar evaluation. We love hearing from you, and we would really appreciate any feedback and suggestions that you have. So once again, if you have the time, please feel free to take this webinar evaluation. But other than that, thank you all for attending, and I hope to see you again soon. And once again, just as a reiteration, if you have any other questions, our emails are listed on this slide, and feel free to reach out to any of us through email if you have any questions or you want more resources.
All right, I'll leave this slide up for just a moment in case anyone would like to write down our contact information. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.